This is an open letter to the Seattle Times and Seattle media generally regarding decoding the headlines, or what I like to call a kinder, gentler form of racism in Seattle. On April 12th, the Seattle Times editorial board published an article asking that the current mayor, Edward B. Murray, not seek re-election. This is an unprecedented turn of events in Seattle politics, regardless of whether or not Mayor Murray is guilty of the allegations, and we should let the court process play out. As my campaign has already stated, it is without a doubt true that the current mayor is facing a political crisis. While the Seattle Times advice might seem imprudent to some, it is 100% their prerogative to make such prescriptions. Though, with such a strong position, one might hope the reasons the editorial board would say such things is out of concern for survivors of sexual violence, who, irrespective of the claims, are likely to endure additional trauma as there's a rehashing of sexual violence in the media. Or perhaps the Seattle Times feels that more than one allegation over decades is a lot for an acting mayor to carry. These are human reasons, in my opinion, which you could consider seemingly respectful of all parties, as well as showing some amount of empathy towards survivors of sexual violence and abuse. But that's not why the Seattle Times wants the mayor not to seek re-election. Unfortunately, the Seattle Times is not concerned with the human reasons. Rather, the Seattle Times is instead focused strictly on political reasons, which has more to do with maintaining the status quo of big business in Seattle than it does with the overall health of our Seattle communities. The Seattle Times editorial board seems most concerned with the fact that Mayor Murray, the business establishment candidate, may be vulnerable to a challenge by a people-powered grassroots campaign, such as my own. They state, and I quote, "If he runs under that cloud, it increases the possibility of a Mayor Shama Sawan or some other extreme left-wing ideologue steering this booming city wildly off course. An open field would draw better mainstream candidates who can build on Murray's work." First of all, does the Seattle Times know that Seattle City Council member Shama Sawant is not running for mayor of Seattle? Not to mention, the council member spoke out in favor of my campaign for mayor at my campaign kickoff rally. Well, then let's be clear. The Seattle Times is actually talking about me. As the Seattle Stranger correctly pointed out, I, Nikkita Oliver, am the other extreme left-wing ideologue they did not even have the decency to mention by name. I am the candidate the Seattle Times, the Seattle PI, the Seattle Weekly, and the Stranger tend to identify as the Black Lives Matter activists. I do certainly advocate for Black lives and am a proud organizer in the movement. I am, after all, a Black mixed woman myself, so it makes sense that I would advocate for my life, the lives of my family members, and my community that are still deeply impacted by racism and police brutality in a city that's under consent decree for excessive use of force. That said, I'm also a published writer, a licensed attorney, and an educator with a Master's of Education and a Juris Doctorate from the University of Washington. For over 12 years, I have worked with youth and families of every race, color, and ethnicity in our city doing work around advocacy, community development, and grassroots organizing. For the record, I am just as multifaceted and intersectional in my identity as any other mayoral candidate in this race. I also have just as many merits and experience to attach to my name. What the Seattle Times seems most concerned about is ensuring that whoever ends up mayor will maintain the status quo of big business, gentrification, and push-out in Seattle. While the Seattle Times does not call me by name, the implication that a people-powered grassroots campaign can shake up Seattle politics is without a doubt true. This is evidenced by the 800-plus attendees who came out to my campaign kickoff, to the thousands of dollars, and I mean thousands, nearly 25,000 raised by individual donations, absolutely no corporate donations by an independent party candidate, to the countless members of the community that I've held listening sessions with. It is clear there is a need and a thirst for a different kind of politics in this city. Make no mistake, All of these things, including the plea for more well-moneyed, connected white folks to get in the race, such as former Mayor Mike McGinn, the subtle swipes and passive-aggressive statements, the constant mislabeling and questioning of my experience, irrespective of my hard-earned merits and work in this city, are intended to prevent women of color, young people of color, and cash-poor folks from seeing themselves as mayor, and intended to deter us from ever giving it a try. These things appear intentional. How do we know this? Because they happen over and over again and are the reason why this city has not seen a woman as mayor since 1926. That is 91 years. And we've never seen a woman of color as mayor, despite having numerous qualified candidates. And when I say qualified, I do not mean your typical career politicians. I do mean those candidates who will truly implement progressive policies. And we have to accept that these candidates may not come from traditional routes, but this does not belittle their experience. Finally, speaking of these extreme left-wing ideologues, I do not understand how wanting schools fully funded so children and families can have the educational opportunity promised them is extreme. I do not understand how wanting those who have lived in Seattle for generations to be able to continue to live here affordably is extreme, nor do I understand how not wanting to build a brand new $230 million youth jail to imprison on average 35 children a day is extreme, especially since all of the scientific evidence tells us that imprisoning youth, especially those youth who are accused of nonviolent crimes and status offenses, is literally the worst thing we could do for those young people and overall public safety in Seattle. Notwithstanding the fact that wraparound services to prevent young people from becoming sex workers as a means of survival is not extreme, creating sufficient affordable housing so those same young people do not become homeless in the first place is not extreme. We cannot ignore the fact that those who have made allegations of sexual abuse, regardless of whether or not those claims have merit, were unquestionably homeless and vulnerable, and this put them in dangerous positions. This is what I am fighting for. Affordable housing, the right to stay, educational opportunity, transformation of the criminal legal system, accessible human services, and equity and justice for all. If that's the wrong thing, I guess I'm wrong. But next time, say my name.